Hello, I'm Jeanette Nyden, and this is the When Does the Contract Act as a Referee video. When does the contract act as a referee? So thank you for those of you who are responding to my videos, sending me emails, writing me comments in LinkedIn. I genuinely appreciate it. We've had some really robust conversations, and I'm going to distill some of those conversations into further videos as those conversations continue. So thank you. Please email me or contact me through LinkedIn. All right, so in a simple sentence, a simple answer, when conflicts arise, the contract should act as a referee. Okay, so that's kind of a dumb moment, but specifically, like, where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this are things particularly around scope creep. So everyone on the customer side, and I've done a couple of customer deals this summer. I have a 50-50 practice. I haven't been on the supplier side since January. They all complain about scope creep, but because I work on the supplier side, I hear their perspective of it, and it's always because of a lack of clarity around the scope in the first place, or a lack of understanding about how the service is delivered, a lack of understanding about the resources needed, lack of understanding that you just can't come along. And I've been in several of these where literally the customer has notions about what is capable and in what time frame, but without understanding the service, what is capable and what that time frame is actually becomes scope creep. It actually becomes an additional need for resources and for people and materials in some circumstances that's not warranted and wasn't baked in, especially into a fixed price agreement. So I'm going to focus on when the statement of work, the SOW, is unclear. It's unclear as to the work, and it's unclear as to the acceptance criteria and the approval process. Now, this is huge, and in my contract professionals playbook, which you can email me and get more information about, it's a 240-page playbook with like 30 tools, so it's substantial. But I talk quite a bit about acceptance, and I bake acceptance into my templates on how to create and revise statements of work. This is a really big deal because milestones and phasings are not the same as acceptance criteria. And if you've got an incomplete statement of work in some way, technically incomplete, and you don't have clear acceptance criteria, then you've got a real problem. Now, for those of you who do any kind of Agile or Scrum types of IT work where you develop the scope of work and you get to the end and then you develop the scope of work for the next phase, etc., this still applies. Like, you still have to have a good scope of work when you go into phase one. You still have to have solid acceptance criteria. Are we ready to move into phase two? And then you need to develop collaboratively with your IT supplier what that scope of work looks like for phase two, again, with good, clear acceptance criteria. So that kind of moving target can work. And the way that I would do it is a master services agreement, with each phase being its own statement of work with its own KPIs, acceptance criteria, approvals, reporting, etc., sort of making it hang, if you can imagine, like little crystal thingies hanging off of an umbrella. Okay, so let's do that. Like, you had a little fancy umbrella. I know it's stretching. Okay, so the goal, again, we want clarity and completeness in the agreement. We want to avoid scope creep for lots of reasons. It's painful for everybody. Nobody likes it. Resentments develop. And it's avoidable. It's totally avoidable. Use my checklist if you want. There's a free checklist video that you can get access to. Email me if you don't find the link, and I'll give it to you with the chapter on how to do it. So because it's avoidable, let's avoid conflicts. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a legitimate question about increasing the scope, and this often happens, or we're going to have a legitimate phase two. We need to renegotiate the scope for a more complete phase two. So what can we do? So as a piece of advice, let's start with the incomplete and unclear scope of work. And let's start talking about that, how we can make it clear. And this would also apply for developing a new scope of work for phase two. You want to have a scope change process that is documented. Now, I've had several suppliers, and I've done these multi-$100-million deals for the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of suppliers balk at this because some of them have a more handshake way of wanting to do it, but the process is critical. absolutely critical. So you want a scope change process. And then when you are in the scope change or the creating of the phase 2, you want to follow the process. So at a high level, number one, you develop the written process with customer approval. So one of my clients has a form. Well, what we did is we just took sort of the tribal knowledge, you fill out this form and Steve signs on it, blah, 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 and we baked it into the scope change process. So now in order to change the scope of a 10-year, that was again another $80 million agreement over 10 years, we had to follow the scope change process. And of course, within 2.5 years, the whole team changes and my client comes back to me because there was a scope change question. And it had to do with following the process. And we followed the process and the parties were happy. So, we really need to pay attention that the customer approval process is important. 2, we added an appeal because it was a very large and very complex relationship and scope of work to a more senior level. So if Steve is like to the supplier, this is not a scope change, I'm reading the scope, I'm reading your proposal, your Form A, and I don't think it's a scope change, it's within scope, we actually baked in an appeal process so that both Steve and the supplier representative had to go to somebody else within my client organization to sort it out. So it removed Steve from potentially being a tyrant. Not saying that Steve would be a tyrant, there was always that potential. Then we required either way, whether it was approved or not approved, or it had to go to an appeal process, you had with your Form A to provide a business case. So the supplier had to put together a business case using the pricing structure and the pricing model outlined in the compensation section of the statement of work. So we used the same model, the same A plus B plus C equals X dollars for a business casing of a scope change. Now the numbers changed because of cost of living for labor, and it was unionized labor, and et cetera. So it was a little bit complicated, but it was a fully loaded T&M labor model. And that was the A part of it. But nevertheless, we understood what that was so that we could go in and pull in a 2018 number, even though this was negotiated back in 2015, because we had it all formulaically laid out, and that business case then supported the decision making and the budgeting for the client. And so, really the supplier was really pushing back at the time, and my colleague Debbie and I were just saying, this is going to help you. Like, we can't budget based on magical thinking and magical numbers. We need real numbers. We need a business case. If you could please provide it using the same formula you used to bid on this project to win the award in the first place, that same pricing model formula, we can get it budgeted. And that's actually what ended up happening with like $20 million addition that my client decided to do about 2.5 years after the agreement was inked. So it's a good thing, right? Like, this helps suppliers. 4, add a presumption against scope change language in the scope changes. Now, this is a strategic insertion. In other words, when I advocate for my clients that I'm putting this in, I'm very clear that we are authorized, my direct client at the customer, we, the contracting team, are authorized then to look at the scope of the work before the deal is inked and to open any cabinets, drawers, closets, and clean them out. So when I put this language in, you got to use a form. There's an appeal process if we say no, the original signature says no, and you got to have a business case with it. And there's a presumption against scope changes to this agreement. We often get the technical people back in the room because the supplier often says, no, I'm not going to agree to that. Why? Well, because you've got an incomplete statement of work, or this isn't fleshed out, or you haven't considered this, which is exactly my point. I want a precise scope of work. I want a precise fixed fee or cost plus arrangement for budgeting. I want precise KPIs. I want precise actual to budget, meaning we budgeted XYZ for a 10-year agreement year over year, and what's the actual? That's one of the KPIs. Because I want precision, let's go into these drawers, closets, and cabinets and let's clean them out, which is what we did. And we did that in a collaborative way. Didn't really change the pricing too much. We got some very great, I would actually say great trade-offs to get some really good pricing. And it was phenomenal supplier, and I really liked their contract manager. She was the supply side. She was phenomenal. And then finally, number 5 is add a formal change order with an execution, meaning you've got to have a contract change order, as my client calls it, a CCO. And so unfortunately, some organizations run a little fast and loose and they can do it by email or whatever. No. So this is one of those areas when it talks about scope change where there's a significant dollar amount. You have a signature, you have an execution, and it's an actual addendum to the statement of work and or the master services agreement. So it's enforceable. It's not an email that somebody who leaves the company later approved and somebody else comes in and doesn't want to approve it. Because I've been in those kinds of invoicing arguments where, Kurt left the customer's organization. It looks like his email approved a significant amount of work and there's no change process, there's no budget, there's no formal execution. Does my client pay that $1.5 million invoice or not? That becomes a difficult conversation. Okay, so what's the other way that the contract acts as a referee besides is it within scope? How do we do multiple phasings of scopes? You do it through this process because this is in the contract, so that's the referee part. Number 2, acceptance. Okay, so acceptance criteria are not necessarily milestones in phasing. Acceptance criteria are different. And I've got this in my contract professionals playbook. And if you want it, you want the information, come talk to me because I'm going to be running a course in January that you might very well be interested in, where we're going to be talking about this along with risk identification and all kinds of other complicated and yummy, juicy topics. Okay, so you need to consider a 2-prong approach to acceptance criteria when you're looking at acceptance criteria. When you are originally developing your acceptance criteria, this is really a technical peer-to-peer conversation at the SME at its best. What I can do and what I've often done is ask the question. So I get to the acceptance and a statement of work, and I did this for an RFP that I wrote, I guess it must have been about 2 summers ago, where there was just no acceptance criteria. Like they had done all the technical details, but they hadn't thought about, well, how am I going to accept if the supplier has actually built this machinery to deliver this chemical process to us and does it test right and all these sorts of things. And so what I just did is I did it through a series of questions. What does complete look like? And then further drilling down from what does complete look like. So I went into the technical scope of work and I started asking questions. Well, what does this implementation look like? How do we move from this part of testing into this part of testing? And again, it was machine to a service to an output, and we were buying the chemical output. So it's a little bit easier mechanical mind for me to think it through, but it's the same principle for IT work. And so what you do if you're the contract professional and you've got to figure this out is you go into the statement of the work, and to the best of your ability, you've got to whiteboard the process with someone. What is this? What is this? What is this? And my advice to you as the contract professional is you do it through questions. Okay. And you don't leave it up to happenstance, because you want your corrective action plan to fit with your acceptance criteria. So what happens if the design looks like the most beautiful machinery in the whole world and it doesn't function, right? You don't accept it. You want a corrective action plan. How are we going to go back in and correct it? And this is true for IT too. How are we going to correct it so that it functions? Is that a T&M process? Is that part of the fixed fee? If it's a cost plus, how do we do it with that? If it's a third-party vendor that's not performing and it's a module or a piece of software or machinery into my supplier, how do the flow downs work? So you really want to ask the questions, and you really want to connect the dots with acceptance. And acceptance is different from an approval process, okay? So approvals means, yeah, I got the drawings. Yeah, I looked at the drawings. Yeah, you guys can start to build XYZ out. Yeah, you can bring your team in next week to start meeting with us to start doing your initial data collection or something like that, right? And acceptance, though, is a major trigger that says it meets the standards and criteria set out in the statement of work to the point where we not only accept the goods, which starts the warranty period, but we're also willing to pay, right? So acceptance is a critical portion. And for conditional acceptance, which is probably really what I'm talking about here now that I think about it, the conditions are the specifications, and acceptance is only granted upon the meeting of those specifications. So that's conditional acceptance. And again, it's in my contractor's playbook if you're interested. Contract professionals playbook, excuse me. The other way that acceptance acts and as a, excuse me, the other way that the other way that the contract acts as a referee in acceptance has to do with the governance model. And so for these larger complex agreements, I really recommend a 3-tiered governance model. So what's the day-to-day peer relationship? What's the management relationship? And then what's the executive relationship? So remember when I said, okay, well, put in your scope change that there's an appeal process. What I'm talking about is the governance, right? So Steve and his peer, let's just say his name is Scott. The two of them are talking about a scope change. Scott from the supplier says, yeah, this is an absolute scope change. Here's the scope of work. You know, here's our Form A. Here's our budget for it on a fixed fee. And Steve says, yeah, no, I don't think it's a scope change at all. And Scott says, we're not going to do it if you don't approve it as a scope change because it's not within scope, right? It goes up to the management level. And again, in an ideal situation, there would be someone from the supplier and someone from the customer in that management level that would look at it and determine, is this or is this not part of the scope change? And so we did something similar to that. We got some other people's voices involved, and the supplier was able to convince us that it was in fact a scope change. It was worth $20 million. Here's our budget. And now they're in the process of implementing it. So that's another way within the acceptance, is because we couldn't go forward on the work until something was done and it wasn't part of the scope. And I think what ended up happening is my client assumed they would be able to do it in-house and they couldn't. And so governance is another way within acceptance and within an agile or a scrum style of statements of work, or within an incomplete statement of work or unclear acceptance criteria, that the contract can act as a referee. Again, these concepts are all put in my contract professionals playbook, the 12-week training session, the 30 some odd tools. Let me know. I would be delighted to share that with you. I'd be delighted to co-negotiate a big deal with you. So just let me know how I can help you. And I hope this video has been helpful. Give me a shout out. Thanks.